Hey, everybody. Looks like people are still kind of piling into the room. So I'm going to give everyone about 30 more seconds to just get your tea, coffee, water ready for the next hour. Stick with us and we'll talk about some cool things. So give you all about 30 more seconds. Natalie, can I get a thumbs up on screen sharing?
Yep, looks great.
Excellent. Okay. All right, it's about 15 people with the number climbing, so we'll just go ahead and get started. So thank you all so much for coming today to our fourth support seminar. Time is really flying. We're already on number 4. Today's topic is going to be the financial plan workbook and the financial plan kind of as a whole, and then startup grant best practices. All right. So to kick things off, my name is John Garland. I see some familiar names in the room today. Most of you all know Natalie Elliott as well. She's been on the support seminars as well as all 3 app info sessions. Collectively, we are the new schools team. Today we have David Marks with us, who's Director of Financial Compliance, and then Lindsay Denman, who is also Director of Resources and Supports. So David, today he's going to be talking to you about best practices in terms of budget, financial plan, the financial plan workbook. And then Lindsay will finish up today talking about the charter school startup grant, the CSP as we call it, best practices. So that's going to be our agenda today. I'm going to kick things off with some reminders and some norms in case this is your first support seminar. So one key reminder, we sent out our weekly update email this morning. That should have gotten to you all. That let you know that the FAQ document is now available and ready for you all to download and look at, as well as last week's support seminar is up for your review. If you are not getting those weekly update emails, please email the charter application inbox so we can add your email to it. We are getting a couple bounce backs, so if you're one of those people you haven't been getting these, let us know. All right, in terms of norms, so we have tried to disable the chat function as we do every week. So please, if you have questions, enter those into the Q&A, and to the extent that we can answer them, again, remember this is a competitive process. So to the extent that we can answer them, we will. And also this time is set aside for you to ask questions to either David or Lindsay. And then also we'll leave some time at the end for any general questions about the application that either Natalie or I can answer. So that is kind of the layout for today. Wanted to ground our conversation, however, as we always try and do, into the evaluation criteria. So I want to just kind of put a caveat on this, that this is not an extensive list of all the criteria to which you will be scored or evaluated on. Really, these are to just sort of highlight some of the most pressing ones that really impact our conversation today. In terms of the startup year, just kind of want to highlight going forward and grounding your understanding of what Lindsay's going to talk about today is really presenting expenses and revenues in that startup plan that are congruent with the financial plan workbook. Also identifying personnel, materials, and other expenses that are going to support the outlined grant activities. And again, these things will make a bit more sense as Lindsay kind of takes a little bit of a deeper dive into the CSP grant. And then also presenting a sound plan indicating how the board will monitor the implementation of that startup plan, the startup grant, and then that, of course, the associated budget. And then lastly, just including a clear plan for maintaining financial sustainability after the end of the grant, which is extremely important. And then David's going to talk a bit about just how you are aligning the financial plan with the narratives, the attachments, the workbook. All of these things have to be kind of really in sync throughout the whole proposal. A lot of times we see sort of that breakdown when we ask questions during the interview process. And then also just with attachment F2, if you all haven't looked into that yet, that's a financial plan workbook, just making sure that you have contingency plans to meet those financial goals. And then if any anticipated revenues are not received or lower than expected, what you'll do about that. And then also, and extremely important, is proposing contract services that are going to fully align with the financial plan workbook. We just want to ground you in these. So as you all kind of digest what David and Lindsay are telling you, Maybe this will also help you formulate questions, but always start with the evaluation criteria, because as we say in the app info session, this is what you're going to get scored on. I mean, this is, I hate to say it's like giving you the answers. It's not giving you the answers, but it's certainly giving you a very clear compass in which you want to direct yourself as, before you submit your narrative on November 4th, or in November rather. So with that said, I will go ahead and kick it over to David for our first presentation. David, are you ready?
Yep.
All righty. And Dave, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. All right. Like John said, I'm David Marks, Director of Financial Compliance. Just briefly about my division, we oversee the schools and the financial resources and financial reporting. You'll be required to submit an annual audit to us every year, and I have a team of auditors that go through those. I also have a group that monitors financial management and is looking for charters or school districts that seem to be struggling in some areas, and we reach out and try to help them based on a risk assessment that we do. And then I also have a team that issues the first ratings. And so after your first year, you'll turn in financial information to us, and we use that financial information to create a rating for you. And I have a team that does that. And then also I have a team that does student attendance. So one side of that shop works on the student attendance accounting handbook, and then the other side does the student attendance audits. And so that's just quick introduction of what me and my team do. Today, though, I'm talking to you about the portion of the application that the finances touch. And you might think you have just these areas that are listed for community engagement, student recruitment, facilities, the school schedule and transportation services, the startup year, and then the financial plan. So within each of those, there is a piece of financial information to that. And from time to time, we will glean information and follow up with you during the interview process if you make it that far, and ask you questions around any of these and maybe other ones. We spend some time looking through in community engagement, student recruitment, and we want to see how the community response has been to your proposed charter. We also want to see what the student interest is and what kind of information you have that supports that. For facilities, generally, we're looking for, if you have a plan or you already have a facility picked out, then we want to know what types of steps that you went through to determine that facility, and that facility was going to be in the best interest of the charter school. If you don't have a facility picked out, then hearing what your plan is for obtaining a facility, and then of course, if you're going to build, then all of the information that goes into building a facility, or if you're going to rent a facility, then what your plan is for that. In the school schedule and transportation services, one thing I want to highlight: school schedule, I will ask about your minutes, especially if they are anything less than 75,600 minutes. That's the minimum number of minutes that you need to have required by law. But a key point, I think, is making sure that you have a threshold that actually exceeds that. If you go back a number of years, you can think about all the different storms we've had. If you're close to the coast, then there may be a hurricane. If you're up in the panhandle, there may be some days when you have ice, or even if you're in South Texas. So a few years ago, the whole state was frozen. So trying to plan for some of those days in which that maybe you have to close is something that we'll look for whenever we're looking at your operational minutes. And then transportation services. If you're planning on transporting students, we want to hear about that. And then if you're not, if you don't have any plans for transportation services, then of course we want to hear about that as well. I think that, having that opportunity to be able to provide the transportation to students is important. And even if that means getting creative with like charters have done in the past, where they help coordinate carpools and things like that. If that's something that interests you or you're thinking about doing for your charter, then we like to hear about that and read about that as well. And then the startup year, it's pretty self-explanatory. What are your plans to get your charter open and ready in that first year? We will definitely spend some time looking at that and paying attention to that. And then finally, the financial plan. What is your plan to operate your charter? That's, we spend most of our time there, but these other areas we look at as well. So there are many, many, many other areas that also are impacted by finance. And so me and my team will also spend some time in governance and looking at the structure and the formation of the community and what you are doing in terms of how you're governing and in your board meetings, what they're going to discuss. Talent management and development. We spent a little bit of time looking at professional development. So if you have, let's say you have a big professional development budget because that's important to you and training your teachers and your school leaders, then we'll want to be able to see that's actually in the financial workbook as well. Same with teacher support and evaluation. If you're contracting that information out or you're going to purchase some evaluation program, then we'll look for that information in other places as well. Leadership, superintendent position, you'll disclose what your plan is for the superintendent and potentially how much you're going to pay the superintendent. We would look for that tracking elsewhere. And then under school design, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but let's say in the special populations for special education, you plan on having one teacher for every special education student. Well, if you put that in your school design and special population side, we're going to go and we're going to be looking for that where you disclose that you have all of your teachers and the number of teachers and how much you're going to pay them. And then that flows into the financial workbook. And so we're going to be looking in each of these different areas to see that each area is supported and that all of this is included in your financial workbook, because after all, if your financial workbook isn't showing that you're going to be able to sustain the operations, then of course we're going to be asking, what is your contingency plans and what is your plan if something doesn't work out? Also in the special population side, we will pay attention to your state funding and how you filled out that template that will generate state funding for you. So if you have at-risk students or English learners, then we're going to be looking for those students in the state funding plan. But then that also, remember, if you have the students listed and in your state funding plan, then you also have to have teachers that can support those students. So we look at it both ways. We look from the teacher side, but we also look from the student side. And then let's see. I'll go to the next slide. So then in the budget narrative, and Lindsay will talk about the CSP funding part, but we do spend quite a bit of time looking in your budget narrative, and we use it as kind of a cross reference with the workbook. So if the bottom bullet point, the workbook and the budget narrative, they should align. If there's something in your budget workbook that maybe isn't included in the budget narrative, then we may ask about that and make sure that trying to figure out which one is correct and that you've got a plan for what you put in one spot, but maybe didn't include in the other. The budget narrative will also support those assumptions that you've made in revenue and expenses or costs in the budget workbook. You'll want to explain the financial plans of the charter. So like what I talked about on the previous slides, you'll want to make sure and explain exactly what your charter plans on doing, how you plan to operate, how you plan to pay for it, those types of things. And then another key point is the narrative provides words for the workbook. There are some comment sections that we will expect for you to include information in, but the narrative really just kind of helps paint that picture and shares what your goal is with your charter. And then finally, again, like I mentioned just a minute ago, the workbook and the narrative, they need to align. And then on the financial plan workbook, just like I just have continued to say, and I will say it over and over because this is one of those things that in my years of looking at the charter applications, there's been some misalignment, or someone will include information in the workbook, but they don't include it in the budget narrative. And so then we start trying to, well, what if we put this in the budget workbook from the budget narrative? What does that do to the bottom line? And then vice versa. And then the assumptions must match other areas in the application. So remember, I talked about how we look at those other areas, and if there's dollar items or funding or expenses in another area, then we do go to the budget workbook and make sure that that information is included in there, so that you are budgeting properly. You can provide an explanation for each of the assumptions made on the startup and assumptions tab. It's an Excel worksheet, and where you're making adjustments. So year over year, you'll say, I have $100,000 that I'm going to do for professional development. And then based on student growth, based on hiring more teachers because of student growth, I'm assuming that this number is going to grow by that amount. And so any of those types of assumptions where you're making some estimates, we expect to see that information included, and we rely on that information. Many years ago, well, I wouldn't say many, that seems too far back. Let's just say, since I've been reviewing these, this portion has gotten stronger and stronger from the applicants, which is good. I remember early on we would come in and sit down for the interviews and do our reviews, and one of the first questions we had to ask was, what assumptions did you make, or why is this box not filled out, but yet you clearly state that you're going to provide this information. And so making sure that those assumptions are in there really helps with our review. And then the fourth bullet point, clearly identify your student populations that are being served on that enrollment tab, because that does drive funding, but that also those all have requirements with them. So each one has some additional requirements. So you've got to have some teachers to be able to support those students. So that would come with an addition, some expense. And then also the three that I have listed there, those you receive additional state allotment funds for those, but there is a required spend amount on each one of those programs. And so there's a minimum amount on each one. These three are 55%, but some of the other ones have a different percentage in there. And so you need to note that you may receive $100 in state comp ed funds for a student, but that $100 has to be spent in a supplemental way, supporting the comp ed student, and that at a minimum 55% of that is required to be spent on them. And so it doesn't all, you don't necessarily get to just spend it all on however you want. that's just something for you to be thinking about as you're working through this. It isn't going to be highlighted in the workbook though. There isn't a spot that says how much do you plan on spending for each of these programs on these kids to meet the state minimum compliance. I'm just giving you this information as you think through your application to help strengthen it and make sure that things are covered. And then some other things to think about when you're going through that workbook. When you're making assumptions, use a reasonable basis like per student, per teacher, square footage. What we're saying is, and sometimes the assumption, because your students increase, you'd have an increase in food cost. Those are pretty logical, but we want to know if that's the reason why you have that increase. Maybe there was another reason why it increased. You started serving breakfast and lunch and maybe even dinner. We would want to know those types of things. Or you went from using a contracted service to preparing all the meals in-house. So aligning those assumptions with what's happening is key. And each assumption and growth may depend on something slightly different. It may not all be just generated because students increase, therefore this has to increase, or it may make more sense to do it per teacher, so like the staff development, or for facility use, square footage. So think about those types of assumptions that you're making on why there's an increase or a decrease, and make sure and document that. On the second one, loans are identified. You've got to remember to include the subsequent payments. A loan has to be repaid, and if you come up with some form of special loan that can turn into a grant, then you'll need to make sure and really document that well, because we will see, if we do see a loan, we're going to be looking for the subsequent payments in the following years, because we'll want to see that you plan for the repayment of the loan. So generally a loan will be taken out early in the process to help get things going. And then in the additional years after that, then we would expect to see the repayment of that loan. And sharing the terms of the loan is important, just so we can get a general idea of what the interest rate and the payment terms are, and how long the loan will be outstanding. And then the third one, some cost increase as the students and staff increase. Other costs will increase at a different rate. I kind of touched on that with the first one. Just really paying attention to what you're doing with the budget workbook, and looking at that revenue, and then looking at the expenses and thinking about them, and maybe looking at how and why they're going to increase or decrease is important. And then that final note, this was common years ago as well. People would, and we get it from time to time now, but generally you guys are doing a great job of making sure that your budgets are balanced, but it still needs to be said, if the revenues, they must exceed your expenses. If not, then you need to think about what kind of expenses you need to lower in order to get the revenues to match that, or you need to think about other ways of generating revenue, and really spending some time looking at that and massaging those numbers to make sure that, one, they're realistic. You don't want to go into your charter and be awarded a charter and your budget wasn't necessarily realistic. So you had some really good ideas, you found a way to be able to pay for the ideas, but in reality, it just didn't work out. So we want to make sure that it's a realistic budget, it's workable, that you can work within the budget that you set for yourself, and and be successful and be a successful charter school. With that, that ends my slides. So if there's any questions, happy to take some time now to go through those, or we wanting to do it at the end. I'm pretty
No,
flexible.
we have a little bit of time right now. Thank you. We have about 5 minutes or so for questions if anybody has some about financial planning, budget alignment, and all the other topics and key advice that David mentioned. So we'll just practice a little bit of wait time and see if anything comes through in the Q&A function.
So we have one question: are charter boards allowed to take loans from CMOs? I'm not an attorney, but typically we don't. That's something that we will scrutinize, and generally we don't allow for. So it will be something, if you have that in your application, be prepared to answer that either from myself or for the attorneys that also do the review.
Any other questions?
One thing I'll say is, as we were going through them last year, and remembering what were some of the more common questions that we had, there was more about local contributions, and we really wanted to look for support on those local contributions, and because without the support, and we know that it's a tough situation, that some people will say, I'll support you if you're granted a charter, or come back when TEA is giving you a charter, then I'll give you money. So it's a hard situation for y'all. We get it, but we do want to know like what types of other contributions are out there. But just putting something in your application without any kind of support, that it gets more scrutiny than if you have the support to support that, because we want to make sure that there is that local support and contributions that you're putting in your budget. Plus, generally, your budget is relying on that information. So we want to know if that support is there or not. And if you say that each of my board members is going to give $50,000, and we're going to be looking for those letters, we're going to be asking for the board members within the interview to state, yes, they're each going to donate $50,000 if that's what you put in there. So we have spent some time and really looking at the local contribution side now. That's a good question. So the first question is asking about if there are any guidelines for how much revenue should exceed expenditures. In first, we do have a requirement about your revenues or about your net position. And we generally say, as a rule of thumb, it's 2 to 3 months. And so with just starting out, we don't necessarily have that high of an expectation. I will ask about some contingencies, or if you say that I'm gonna have $10,000 in contingencies, I'll ask about that, and just to kind of feel around and get a better understanding of what the thought process was behind that. But if you're looking for a specific dollar amount, we don't have a specific dollar amount. The first question actually is at 75 days of operational expenditures, if you're trying to get to what that net position should be. For first purposes, it's 75 days of your operational. And operational expenditures is basically all of your operating expenditures minus depreciation and amortization. And that would get you about what your operations expenses FERS purposes.
And just so you know, if you're not familiar, David's referring to the Charter First financial rating system, which is linked in the resource pages in the Generation 28 application. Many of you are probably familiar, but I just wanted to clarify the term there for you. It is linked in the app, so you will have access to that information and those metrics that David's talking about. Okay, we got a couple more questions.
Okay, thank you for clarifying, Natalie.
No worries.
If we state that we are fundraising X amount of money through fundraising, what questions would you ask us? What info would we need to have on hand? Well, so if you're going to say you're going to raise $100,000 in fundraising, we're going to ask for what types of letters of support that you already have. What makes you think that you're going to be able to get and obtain $100,000? Maybe you have a proven track record of raising money. Maybe someone on your board, that's what they do as their normal job. They're out supporting nonprofits and helping them raise money. So, you know, talking about your past experiences, maybe you've had some pledges from some parents already that, or some other community members that have said that. If they said that, then the more that you can document on paper with letters of support, the more helpful that is for us. Can bonds be used for startup? Bonds can be used for startup. We'll probably ask some more questions about the obtaining the bonds, how you obtained them, because there's going to be another entity that helps you unless you're a long established charter. Maybe you're a charter in other states, and you're able to get bonds. That we'll ask if that's the case, then that will also lead into some commingling and making sure that the Texas state funds stay with Texas and they don't go elsewhere. So but you can, if you're somehow able to obtain bonds as a brand new charter, then you can. And then of course we'll treat it just like a loan and expect for the payback terms, how much you're having to pay back, and making sure that that's going to be sustainable through the future. Most new schools build enrollment in the first few years. Is there an expectation that revenues should exceed expenditures in the first few years, excluding any donation and local support? I'm trying to track with what your question's saying. So as your students increase, your numbers of students increase, then of course that increases your funding. But the more students you get, of course, that also exceeds or increases your expenses. So we don't necessarily have a goal of saying by this time the charter should have this amount of money. If you're able to show that your state revenues and your federal revenues can meet the expenditures and the operations of your charter with excluding any donation or local support, then I think that is a strength for your particular charter. But we will, like I said, we will scrutinize that, knowing that it's a lot of charters it's tough getting out of the gate and really building that momentum. So if you're able and successful at building that momentum before you open your doors and you have 250 students like what you projected, then and you can build a budget off of that, then that would be great. And so we would look at the community engagement to see and that enrollment is going to be supported from the community.
Okay, we have a lull in our questions. If you continue to have questions about this topic, feel free to put them in the Q&A feature. And if David is not able to answer them in today's session, then we will hunt him down and have him answer the questions and include them in a subsequent FAQ supplement. So with that being said, we are right on time to transition into Lindsay Denman's presentation. Thank you, David. Lindsay is our Director of Resources and Supports here in the Charter Division. And I'm just going to turn it over to her to talk more about CSP.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. And thank you, David, too. It's always good to hear from you as well. Hi, everyone. I am Lindsay Denman. Like Natalie said, I'm the Director of Resources and Support. So my team, one of the work streams that we'll oversee is the CSP grant. So I'm really excited to be here with you guys today. I've just kind of stepped into an expanded role. So excited to be a part of your work here. I am going to kind of go over some slides that I know many of you have already seen in info sessions. I just want to kind of go through and highlight a few things about the CSP Startup Grant, and then leave some time, of course, at the end for you guys to ask your questions. Of course, if you have them as I'm yammering on, please feel free to put them in the question box, and I'll take them as they come in as well. All right. So purpose of the CSP and the CSP grant really is about expanding opportunities for students and increasing the number of high quality charter schools that are available across the United States. And I highlight this United States geography because I want to point out at the beginning here that this is a federal grant. So because it's a federal grant and it's run by the U.S. Department of Education, there are a lot of, I know many of you are probably very familiar with working with federal grants, and you know that there are a lot of parameters on federal grants that at TEA, we just kind of don't control a lot of those things. So just kind of putting that out there that some of these things are things that are parameters that are outside of our control there. All right, so eligible applicants. So eligible applicant means that you have applied for a charter school. So if you have submitted an application for Generation 28, then you are eligible to apply for the CSP Startup Grant. And then if you are awarded the charter, so if you are selected by TEA and you're not vetoed by the State Board of Education and you're going to open your charter school, we are going to celebrate, and then you would be eligible to actually receive the grant that you have applied for. Want to make a quick note here on CMOs, on charter management organizations. So essentially, you are eligible to apply if you are essentially, if you're affiliated, let me say it this way, I'll just put it in a simple way. If you are affiliated with a CMO and they have applied for a CSP grant, any other sort of CSP grant, and they've received that grant, then you would not be eligible to receive that grant. So if you are working directly with a CMO, make sure that you're checking that out and make sure that you're eligible to apply and receive that grant. I think where we get most of our questions about this grant is around the allowable use of funds, and then the things that we cannot use these funds for. So I'm going to really just spend the bulk of my time here. But again, if there are other questions not related to this topic, pop them in the Q&A. I almost said the chat. All right, so first topic I want to talk about today is planning versus implementation. So you can use CSP startup funds for both planning and for implementation. And you just have to be really clear about which type of activity you're doing when you are getting reimbursed for those funds. So when you're thinking about your budgets right now, and you're thinking about what funds might be covered or what activities might be covered by the CSP Startup Grant, this is going to kind of help to identify how you would categorize those activities. So planning activities are kind of, what they sound like, right? These are things that are tied to the planning of the educational program. So the things that are getting you ready to go into implementation. This could be refinement of your, of your model and your methods that you're going to use in your school. And it can also include professional development of teachers or other folks that are going to work in your school. On the other hand, implementation activities are tied to really the things that are going to get your doors open, right? So this is anything that's tied to the implementation of a charter school, things like informing the community, getting equipment, materials, supplies, things that are non-consumables. All of those things can be covered by implementation. Any other operational costs that you can't cover from state or from local sources, you can use your CSP Startup Grant to cover those costs as well. And so the most important thing is, it's not about the timing. I think this is what I want to say here, is that it's not sort of like planning happens during this phase and implementation happens during this phase. Generally, it's pretty chronological, right? But your expenditures, when you budget for them, it's going to be tied to the type of activity, regardless of when it happens. So you might have some professional development for teachers that happens a little bit after you order some curricular materials. So that would be an implementation expenditure that happens before a planning activity. All right, so let's talk about allowable costs for our planning activities. So anything that's related to the planning and design of the educational program. I know many of those things are already sort of set and done, of course, after you've applied for your charter. But as you're making refinements or you're making changes, or maybe things to, as you're kind of implementing things that you changed when you did contingencies, anything like that, you can use CSP funds for that. Professional development, like I said, training for teachers and staff can be covered. Those are allowable costs. Special education support is also an allowable cost for planning activities. When we get into the implementation side, the most important thing I think to remember about the allowable costs for implementation is that these are like one-time startup costs. So these should not be things that are going to be recurring costs. Again, it's a grant, right? So it kind of, you only get so much, you get it once, and that's kind of it. So it wouldn't really make a lot of financial sense to plan for ongoing costs necessarily with that grant anyway. But these one-time purchases that are necessary to implement your charter school. So this could include, but not limited to, things like desks, chairs, computers, technology equipment, playground equipment, the fun stuff that's going to go on your campus, that can fall under your implementation activity bucket. Like I said, anything that's non-consumable that's related to your startup activities can be purchased with CSP funds. Textbooks, library books, reading materials, anything that's not like a student workbook would not be covered or would not be an allowable cost here, because that's something that is consumable, right? Like a student's going to use it 1 year, and then you're going to have to order a whole new set of workbooks for the next year of students. So those things that'll be used over and over again, those are the things that can be covered with these CSP funds under implementation. You can also cover any of the costs associated with installation of any of the technology that you're purchasing, networks, telephone systems. That's kind of like that one-time installation cost that you're going to be paying. And so you can use your CSP funds for that as well. Transportation, so any one-time startup costs associated with providing transportation, you can use your CSP funds for. So for example, you could use your CSP funds to purchase a van that you're going to use to transport students to the charter school. You couldn't use the CSP funds for like the ongoing insurance cost, for example, for that van. So the one-time startup cost for transportation is okay. Rental or occupancy costs up to the first 30 days of initial implementation in preparation of the opening of the charter school, you can cover with your CSP funds, but nothing beyond that initial 30 days. You can also use CSP funds for implementation activities that are related to making renovations or minor repairs to a facility. So you can't purchase a facility with these funds. You can't make major upgrades, anything that's going to substantially increase the value of that facility or prolong the life of that facility. But if you've got a broken window or something is leaking, and it's sort of a minor repair, then you can use your CSP funds for that. So you can also use your CSP funds for any financial management software and training. Now, you couldn't use those funds for like ongoing licensing of that software, but if there's like a sort of initial cost for that, then you could use your CSP funds for that. Insurance to cover the equipment that is purchased with the grant funds, property insurance, so not like the car insurance, but the property insurance. Anything else that isn't a sustained cost that you couldn't support from other funding sources, you can use your CSP funds for. What I will say here is that we could probably spend the next 2 days going through a list of can we spend our money on this? Can we spend it on that? What's allowed and not allowed? And we field a lot of those questions So my advice here is one, in the Gen 28 application FAQ, we actually get into some details about what can be and can't be covered with these funds. And also let us know what questions you have. Sometimes somebody will throw out a cost at us that we hadn't necessarily contemplated before. And we have to get some guidance sometimes from our grants folks or from USDOE. So let us know if there's something that you're just not really clear on whether or not it would fall into this allowable cost bucket. I want to talk a little bit about payroll. So generally, you can't use these funds for salaries. However, if you are in the planning phase or up to the first 30 days of initial implementation, so that essentially starts the day after you start serving students, you can cover salaries for anything that's like related to a planning or implementation activity. So it couldn't be somebody's like ongoing teacher salary that's covered by CSP funds, but if you are paying your teachers for coming to a training, something like that, then you can cover those costs with your CSP fund because it's part of your planning and implementation work. This is kind of getting in the weeds, but basically, if you have folks that are sort of let me say it this way. We know that folks that are working in your schools, particularly as you're getting things going, are, it would be very hard to say, I spent this entire day on planning and this entire day on implementation. Some of those things are going to start to, overlap with each other in your day-to-day work. And so you just need to be really if you're going to use any of your CSP funds to cover those planning and implementation activity costs under payroll, you just need to be very careful, I think, about the time and effort records that you're keeping to be really clear that this was a planning activity, this was an implementation activity, this was not something that was ongoing operational work that person was doing, and that's why we covered it with CSP funds. So just keep careful records here. I want to talk a little bit now about the flip side, things that you cannot use these funds for. And of course, we have it in red, so it looks really scary, so you know not to do it. So unallowable costs, field trips can't be covered, hosting conferences, advisory councils. These are actually pretty standard, grant no-nos, right? Cost of membership in any organizations, salaries, of course, beyond that initial 30 days of the implementation phase. Any debt service, rental, occupancy costs for the facility beyond the first 30 days, because then we're kind of out of implementation and planning and we're doing the real work. You cannot buy a building, you can't lease a building, build a new building, none of that can be covered with CSP funds. Again, those minor repair costs could be covered, but any major construction that's going to increase the value of your facility could not be covered by these funds. Anything consumable in terms of instructional materials that you use 1 year and then you have to buy new ones can't be covered. And then the accounting bookkeeping services, again, it's just like that initial purchase of the software that can be covered by CSP funds, but nothing beyond that. Annual audit services, food service, I will say as a person who offers training opportunities using federal grant funds, I feel your pain about not being able to pay for food with these funds. Loan interest, deposits, of course, any religious instruction cannot be covered by federal funds, extracurricular activities, and anything that's outside of the state required PE program would not be allowed to be covered by CSP funds. I'm going to pause there just real quick just to see if anything's, I don't see anything popped into the Q&A section just yet. So feel free to keep those questions coming. I know I just kind of went very quickly over a lot of allowable and unallowable pieces there. Want to just share a couple of notes about the items in your application that are related to the CSP startup grant. Just want to kind of review very quickly some of the questions that you're going to be answering. So you're going to be talking about whether or not you're serving any qualified opportunity zones. You'll answer some questions about statutory requirements, program requirements, and then you'll include a couple of attachments. So for the qualified opportunity zone, if you are opening a charter school in a qualified opportunity zone, and these are set by the Secretary of the Treasury, then you are eligible for priority points in your CSP grant. So if you are awarded your charter, you'll just have to make sure that you provide to us the specific census tract numbers and other information about how you're going to serve these students in these high need areas. So you're going to tell us about that in the application. We'll award you priority points if you're serving students in those areas. And then once you are awarded your charter, then you'll submit some follow-up documentation to us. You're going to answer some narrative questions. I know that you are doing a great deal of writing in these charter applications. So here's a little bit more. So on page 15, you're going to be talking about roles and responsibilities of any sponsoring organizations, partner organizations, CMOs, any relationships that you have with any of those organizations, you'll be sharing there. And that's, one of the things that gets evaluated to see, like, are you working with somebody else that's already getting a CSP grant that would potentially make you not eligible for that grant? Community engagement, so telling us, about how you did a, your needs assessment of the landscape that you're wanting to open your school in, how you have sort of worked with that community to understand the need and build something that's going to respond to the community demand that exists there. So be sure to talk about your specific outreach strategies, and then how you're going to continue that work. So once you have opened your school and you're operating that school, for everything from planning, implementation to the school being in operation, how are you going to continue to sort of engage that community and be really effective, I think, and authentic about how you engage that community and engage those parents. You're going to talk about student transportation plans. So how you're going to meet the transportation needs of all the students at the proposed charter school. This might include something about any vehicles that you might purchase in order to provide that transportation. And then on page 24, you're going to talk about your planned activities and expenditures of grant funds to open and prepare for the operation of your proposed charter school. So this is really, I think, where you can kind of get into what you're going to use that award specifically for. Financial sustainability. So like I said, this is a grant. It's, a one-time amount of money. You do have a little bit of a runway to use all of those funds, but once they're used, they're done. And so we'll want to hear about how you're going to maintain financial sustainability at the end of the grant period. So how do you make sure that you're able to still, run your school the way that you've been running it once those grant funds have been expended? And then my favorite is a SMART goal. So identifying 3 to 5 specific student outcome SMART goals, things that are specific, measurable, attainable, or ambitious. Some people like to call the A ambitious, relevant and time bound, that are going to be achieved by the beginning of the 3rd year, which would be by August of 2025. Just to note here that the grant funds will be available to you through it's about 32 months. So they'll be available to you through about May of 2026. But these goals are going to be specific to what you achieve by August of 2025. You're going to add a couple of attachments. So it's CMO receipt of funds. So if you're working with a sponsoring entity and that's a CMO, are they currently receiving, or are they going to be receiving some other CSP grant funds? And then equitable access and participation. So this is really checking off some boxes to talk about, are there any barriers that you can think of to equitable access or participation in your program or in any sort of services that are going to be funded by this grant on your campus? That was a really sort of rapid fire overview of the CSP grant. I do want to pause here to see if there are any questions. I know we've got just a few minutes left together here. So just pausing to see if anyone has any questions.
So while we wait for questions, I think this is a good time to kind of plug our office hours as we have been doing. Once we start doing office hours, this will be a really good opportunity as you were fishing through those CSP questions to come to those office hours with those. It's a good opportunity for just community and fellowship, but also it's just a good opportunity to ask us any lingering questions that we might be able to relay to Lindsay. We might even invite Lindsay to one or two of those sessions just in case you all do have some additional questions.
Oh, sorry, I did just see that. This is where you would think I would be better at Zoom by 2022. So when you talk about CMO receipt of funds, are you including charters operated by the CMO? So if there are any charters that are operated by that CMO that have also, like, basically the CMO itself can't be double dipping into like CSP funds. So yes, that does include those charters.
As Lindsay mentioned in her presentation, and I believe John mentioned in the weekly reminder email, the current Generation 28 FAQ is posted online, and it does have the CSP section is towards the back, and it is lengthy and extensive, but right now it's our best resource for CSP guidelines. And it's a frequently asked questions document, right? So if these things are occurring to you as you're filling out your financial plan workbook and your budget proposal for that CSP component in your application, feel free to consult the FAQ. It is a good resource for this.
So it looks like we don't have any additional questions. Give everybody about 15 more seconds to speed type your question. All righty. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you, David. As always, we really appreciate you all joining us. For those still in attendance, again, if you have questions, please reach out to us. To the extent that we can answer them, we will always answer them. As a reminder, it's a competitive process. So if you reach out to David or Lindsay, just again, bear in mind, they also are limited in capacity to what they can answer and not answer. So please, if you do have questions, kind of keep them general so we can approach those questions with the best kind of granularity that we can on our side. Y'all have a great day. We will put this recording up here in a couple days, hopefully by Monday, and you'll get another email from us next week. Have a good one, and we'll see you next week, hopefully.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.